talking about the budget, I want to, and the debt, I want to show you a graph because I don't think people actually get a good sense of the government debt and what's happened to it over the last, 30 years? So here's a graph of government debt in the US over the last 30 years. And that's a pretty cool graph. That's not the graph of Tesla stock or Bitcoin or Nvidia. That's a graph of the amount of debt the United States government has, right? Starting out in 1994 when it was somewhere around $5 trillion and going up. And you can see kind of when you get the big, the really changes in the level of debt. After 9/11, military buildup, wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq. Then the financial crisis, massive increase in debt, spending, particularly stimulus, a variety of different stimulus packages that involved taking on massive amounts of debt. Then, surprisingly, after the financial crisis is kind of over, they still keep on taking huge amounts of debt. That is, that doesn't stop. The slope of the graph doesn't change much. A little bit, around 2013, maybe a little bit moderated. But this is the Obama, Trump years where they continue to spend like crazy and they continue to borrow money like crazy, money they don't have. Trump cut taxes, but spends like crazy. And then, of course, you get COVID. And then you get this steep, almost completely vertical line of the debt going up. And then, the rest of the Biden years, which are dramatic increases in debt. And that's where we are today, $36.21 trillion. Now, some of that debt is debt held by other government institutions. So some of that debt is kind of internal Social Security holding government debt, although it still has to be paid because that's the way, by paying that's the way Social Security gets paid. So that's where we are, $36 trillion. GDP, by the way, U.S. GDP is around 30. So we're over 100% of GDP. Now, if you look at just the debt held by the public, so if you take out all the debt held by different government agencies and debt that the government, in a sense, owns itself, it's probably around 29 trillion. I still think the 36 is relevant because the 36 all gets paid out. But even the 29 trillion is about 100% of GDP. So basically, think about this. Think about having debt that is as high as your annual income. And so imagine you have a household, and that's the situation you're in. Let's switch from this graph, right? Imagine your household, that's the situation you're in. I've been in that situation, right? You have debt that is equal to your income. After not to your income, because the government doesn't have income, to the total income of the country. So if you tax the country at 100% and spent none of it on government expenditures, you could pay off the debt. But of course, that's not what happens. You don't tax the country at 100%. You get a fraction of that. And then you actually spend, and you continue to spend, and you plan to continue to spend indefinitely into the future more than what you're bringing in taxes in this case. So this graph that I showed you continues to go up at the same rate. That's the big, beautiful bill. It's debt continuing to go up at that rate. Now, the only time in American history in the past where we have had debt at these levels was during was right after World War II, right? The end of World War II. But here's the difference. At the end of World War II, we had millions of people rejoining the workforce. We had the country shifting from a military industrial base, shifting production to civilian. So a complete shift, right? And we had and we had very little government expenditure. There was no Medicare, there was no Medicaid, there was no war on poverty, there was very little welfare state, there was Social Security, but Social Security was small. It was also, we're about to launch into baby boom. So, a future with lots of people, growing population. And indeed, because of that, the United States could run surpluses because it cut government spending. All that money it spent on the war effort was cut, or a lot of it was cut. We had a Cold War, but generally government spending was cut. Taxes were raised, and indeed, we ran a surplus. And we paid down the debt until the 1960s, when, because of the Vietnam and because of Medicare and Medicaid and because of the welfare state and the war on poverty and everything else, we started running significant deficits again. But even then, from the 60s until the early 1990s, it was still kind of okay. And then it just blew up. It's just blown up. And nobody seems to care, because part of the reality is that the cost of having so much debt is not seen. If you've read Economics in One Lesson, you know that there's a whole concept of the seen and the unseen cost. This goes back to Bastiat. There's what's seen and what's unseen. And, a lot of what the Peter Schiff and others, particularly libertarians, tell us, we're heading towards a collapse. The dollar is going to go to zero. The world is going to collapse. Standard of living in the United States will collapse. We're heading toward a Great Depression. Stock market is going to go down 80%. All this stuff. That is seen. And the reality is that hasn't happened. And as debt has increased since the 1990s, people have warned, this is bad. Bad things are going to happen. This is, we shouldn't do this. We shouldn't run huge budget deficits. We should cut spending. And politicians ignored it. And nothing bad is seen. Nothing bad happened, it appears. But that's a fallacy. The real bad stuff is happening because of all the lost opportunities that we had. Imagine, instead of spending trillions of dollars today to pay interest on the debt, borrowing those trillions were still in the private sector being invested in American business. Imagine the government not borrowing huge trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars in order to fund the deficits. But instead, that money stayed in people's pockets. They need to invest it. They're not buying government bonds because the government is not issuing enough for them to buy, so they have to look for other investments, which means invest in businesses and increase productivity, invest in startups, invest in productive activity. So the cost is the lost dynamism in the U.S. economy. The cost is lower wages. The cost is a lower standard of living. The cost is less investment in everything that investment produces. Higher wages, higher standard of living, higher productivity, much greater GDP growth. Everybody compliments the U.S. economy because it's done much better than Europe. God, what a standard. what we don't see, we can see it's done better than Europe. That's the scene. What we don't see is how much better it could have done. What we don't see is how rich we could be, how rich we should be, if not for this massive government spending. And of course, most of this is distorted by the fact that the Federal Reserve manipulates interest rates so that we don't suffer the full consequences of all this debt, because you'd expect that as the government takes on more and more and more debt, interest rates would go up and up and up and up, because there's more and more chance the government won't pay back that debt. Or if it does pay it back, it probably will pay it back, but if it does pay it back, when it does pay it back, it'll pay it back with inflated dollars. Either way, you'd expect interest rates to reflect that. But interest rates are not fully driven by a market, because the Fed is there. And throughout the 2000s, 2010s, the Fed was manipulating, buying bonds, selling, particularly buying bonds, and manipulating interest rates across the entire yield curve. So, this debt is costing us. Even if we don't have a cataclysmic collapse, although we might at some point have the cataclysmic collapse. And the thing is about the debt levels as they are today, imagine if we have financial crisis like 2008 again. And it's quite possible, as we'll talk about later when we talk about Freddie and Fannie, that we will have another financial crisis or some kind of financial crisis in the future. One of the ways you could argue, one of the ways the government responded to that, and conventional economists think you should respond, is with massive bailouts and with lots of goodies handed out, stimulus they call it. And they could do that because the level of debt in the U.S. economy were government debt relative to today low. They could borrow more. But if they try to do that today, or let's say there's a war with China, and we really have to invest in rearming, in building manufacturing capacity to build the weapon systems we need in order to fight with China, where's that money going to come from? We'll borrow even more. Who's going to lend us the money? And what interest rates will they demand? And at some point, right now, interest on the debt, just interest on the debt, is the second largest government expenditure after Social Security. At some point, it will be the largest. I mean, at some point, at the rate we're going right now, I think within 10 years, at the rate we're going right now, within 10 years, interest on the debt is going to be 2/3 of government spending. 2/3 is just interest on the debt. Now, the good thing about interest on the debt is it's going back to the private sector to be invested elsewhere, maybe in buying more government debt, rather than just redistributed. But it's still a complete distortion. And it is a redistribution, right? They're taking our tax money and borrowing to pay previous borrowing, with no plan to pay it all off, with no conception of how to pay it all off. I mean, literally, there's no plan on the table on how this is ever going to pay. I mean, interest on the debt is going to bury this government with no ability to do anything. And what is Trump doing? Nothing. Nothing. He loves this. Cutting taxes, which is meaningless if you're taking on so much debt. There's no advantage to cutting taxes if you're taking on debt. I mean, one of the things about Milei is he didn't start off by cutting taxes. he's slowly over time cut some taxes. But his big thing was not to come in and cut taxes like stupid Republicans are. I mean, it is the stupid party. It really is. I mean, if you were going in today, if I were going in today and could, run Congress, I wouldn't cut taxes. I might reform taxes and simplify them. But even that is not a major priority. The entire focus, the entire priority should be, as was with Millet, cut government spending and deregulate, unscale. Not that little bit they're doing. Cut government spending massively. I mean, Alex is pretty happy that they're cutting a significant chunk of the Inflation Reduction Act, the subsidies. And yeah, I mean, it's better than nothing. And it's a step in the right direction. And they weren't going to do it. So it's a huge achievement that they're doing it, that they're cutting even that. And there's a threat, a risk that the Senate is going to reverse that. But what we really want is for them to cut it all. And not stop there. All subsidies to all industries across the board. All subsidies should be cut, eliminated immediately. I mean, Trump keeps declaring emergency, states of emergency, so he can cut immigration, so he can put on tariffs, so he can control our lives. How about declaring a real emergency? An emergency around the budget. We're spending more money than we can afford. And as a consequence of this emergency, we're doing away with the tax cuts that Trump has proposed, and we are going to start slashing government spending. And by the way, because it's an emergency, the American people, I'm here and I'm telling you, we need a reform, at the very least, reform entitlements. Now, I want to get rid of the entitlements, but at the very least, an honest politician would tell the American people, we need to reform entitlements. I mean, I don't know, things like we need to raise the retirement age on Social Security. We need to change Medicare. We need to do all kinds of things. Continuing on the path we're on is insanity. And the numbers are the numbers. They're right there. That graph cannot continue going in that direction without right now, the consequence of lower growth, less economic growth, less economic vitality, less investment, less everything like that. But at some point, it's much worse than that. At some point, it's negative growth. At some point, you fall off a cliff. You really do fall off a cliff. So, I think a lot of people, I think a lot of politicians basically know all this, and their attitude is, not on my watch. As long as the catastrophe doesn't happen on my watch, kick the can down the road, because that's the easiest thing to do. I think some tech people believe, I think in their extreme naivete, that tech is going to, we're going to have so much growth in the economy, and I think Trump believes this to some extent. I think some people around Trump believe it, that the deregulation that Trump is doing is going to lead to such massive economic growth that the growth will increase taxes and shrink the deficit, and we'll get a balanced budget. That's the rationalization MAGA people engage in. The rationalization is we're deregulating, we're cutting taxes that'll spur economic growth, which will increase tax revenue, which will reduce the deficit, maybe even get us to surplus. AI. I've seen people say with AI, the economy is going to grow 10% GDP growth. It's complete fantasy. Complete fantasy. you could argue that we are being bailed out from a catastrophe by economic growth, by technology, by Silicon Valley. And I've been saying that for years. If not for Silicon Valley, this country would be in shambles. But that cannot continue forever. And indeed, the more the government borrows, the less capital is available for all these other, for investment. So, it's, again, Trump came in with a mandate, and I think Elon Musk came in DOGE with a mandate to go crazy, to be radical, to create change, to really shift things around. And instead, they're just doing, on the economic side, they're worse than conventional Republicans. They spend like conventional Republicans. They do tax rates like conventional Republicans. And their deregulation, while it might be significant, particularly in the environmental realm, is still way, way, way below what is necessary and what is possible, and what the promise that one had in electing somebody who was as crazy and different and revolutionary potentially as Trump. But it turns out he wasn't, as I expected. As I told you, he would not be. He's just another, he's not a conventional Republican, but when it comes to economics, he doesn't really care that much. And he is a statist, and he is a central planner, and all his instincts are anti-capitalist. He does not have capitalist instincts. Ideas. Instincts is the wrong word. He's not consistent with capitalism in terms of his inclinations. The debts and government spending, he doesn't care about all that. He really doesn't. The rationalization is, because I'm such a great president, the economy will grow so fast, it won't be relevant. That didn't happen the first term. It's not going to happen this term. And tariffs are going to destroy that ability, even if the potential was there. Tariffs will undo the benefits of deregulation will be undone by tariffs, and the crazy central planning of this administration and the uncertainty that they create. But I just give you an example. One example of he doesn't care is this parade that they're having in Washington, D.C. You know about this parade? There's going to be a parade on, when is it? Later this month, June 14th. So next week, in 8 days, there'll be a parade to commemorate, I guess, Donald Trump's birthday and the end of World War II or something like that. It's just a grandiose thing for Trump. And the parade is, they brought in tanks, and there's going to be potentially significant damage to Washington, D.C. infrastructure. I don't know if you've ever seen a road that a tank is driven on. It's not pretty. Lots of equipment, tanks, and personnel carriers, and it's his birthday and Flag Day, right? It's going to cost, by low estimates, it's $25 to $40 million. For what? To bolster Trump's ego. $25 to $40 million for, in a government that is running massive deficits and can't pay the bills. And this is not a cut you have to make to the budget. This was never budgeted for, so this is an extra expense. This is just, don't do it. Don't add this expense. So, yeah, and think about military parades. Who has military parades? I know the U.S. has had military parades in the past, usually to commemorate a victory in a war. We have military parades. But who has military parades? North Koreans are really good at it. Putin is really good at it. I don't know if even the Chinese have military parades. I don't know. That would be a good question. But it's an authoritarian kind of thuggish, look at how strong we are, look how powerful we are, and it's an opportunity for the commander-in-chief to take credit for, look how powerful we are. We're going bust, but we've got money to spend on parades, on military parades, something that's, I think at the end, pretty un-American. Pretty un-American. But then again, Trump is an un-American president, very much an un-American president.